Catherine did not scream, she did not weep, and she uttered absolutely nothing. She merely stared at her husband's hand, resting intimately over the hand of another woman, and in that exact, devastating instant, she resolved to vanish forever. What no one inside that elegant Chicago establishment comprehended, not even the man sitting across from his mistress, was that Catherine was not departing entirely alone, and this silent verdict would shatter Michael's world years later in a manner he could never have endured imagining. That rainy afternoon was not the genesis of their collapse. It was simply the quiet conclusion of a treasure he had carelessly squandered without ever noticing its absence. Michael had perpetually operated under the illusion that he maintained absolute dominion over every facet of his existence, from his booming corporate firm to his meticulously structured marriage, until a single, soundless choice stripped everything away from him. The most devastating blow was not her immediate absence, but the crushing revelation years down the line regarding what she had carried away with her to a place he could not reach. To truly grasp the magnitude of this tragedy, one must understand the essence of who Catherine and Michael were before the shadows crept in, because without that context, the ensuing agony lacks its rightful, piercing sting. There are rare, profound souls who wander into your timeline and suddenly bestow a beautiful meaning upon the chaos, and Catherine embodied that extraordinary breed of human being. He crossed paths with her on a damp Thursday in November, amidst the relentless drizzle of the windy city, just after stepping out of a draining boardroom meeting that had left his spirit entirely hollowed out. He sought refuge in a cozy coffee shop on the ground floor of his skyscraper, and there she sat, bathed in the amber glow of a table lamp, gazing thoughtfully at an open paperback novel that she was clearly not reading. Michael noticed the peculiar detail immediately. The book rested entirely upside down on the wooden surface, prompting an amused, curious inquiry from him as he approached her little corner table. She met his gaze without a trace of haste, lacking any automatic reflex of embarrassment, and softly explained that sometimes the most beautiful endings simply demand to be read before the beginnings. He failed to comprehend the depth of that philosophy in that fleeting moment, only grasping its profound truth years later, when their own ending had brutally arrived, while he still foolishly believed they were existing in their beginning. Their romance commenced at a leisurely pace, blooming gently, much like all things of genuine, lasting substance tend to do in a world obsessed with speed and superficiality. He would phone her on Monday evenings, and she would eagerly anticipate his company by Friday, meeting halfway without the suffocating weight of grandiose, empty promises that usually accompany modern romance. For Michael, this unassuming dynamic was an entirely foreign landscape, as he had historically been a man defined by theatrical gestures, exorbitant floral arrangements, exclusive dining reservations, and dazzling gifts that ultimately masked a profound lack of emotional presence. Catherine, however, hungered for none of those superficial, costly displays. Her sole, quiet demand was his authentic presence, his genuine emotional availability, and for a beautiful, albeit brief, period in their shared history, he genuinely provided exactly that. They exchanged their sacred vows exactly 3 years following that rainy November encounter, celebrating in a profoundly intimate ceremony, attended solely by those who truly mattered to their hearts. Catherine stood radiant with freshly picked wildflowers woven gently through her hair, while Michael stared back at her from the altar with eyes glistening with unshed tears, firmly convinced he had never made a more brilliant choice in his entire earthly tenure. The true tragedy did not manifest in his subsequent, obvious betrayal, but rather in the insidious, silent moments when he initially began to avert his gaze, drifting away without a single, blaring alarm to jolt him back to reality. Marriages rarely detonate in a single catastrophic explosion. Instead, they crumble silently through unnamed, minuscule moments, widening through seemingly insignificant cracks, until the foundational walls completely dissolve into unrecoverable dust. The very first time Michael returned home unacceptably late, without a simple phone call, Catherine remained awake, keeping his evening meal perfectly warm in the oven, without uttering a single syllable of reproach. Yet something deep within her spirit meticulously recorded the slight. When the second transgression occurred, she pointedly neglected to warm the food, yet maintained her profound silence, archiving another painful emotional withdrawal in her weary, aching heart. By the third offense, she merely extinguished the kitchen lights and retired to their cold bedroom entirely alone, highlighting the minuscule fractures that Michael deliberately chose to ignore. These quiet, unlit evenings in their desolate kitchen marked the true inception of their demise, long before the upscale restaurant and long before the other woman entered the narrative to deliver the final blow. Yet, what remained utterly concealed from the outside world was the agonizing internal battle raging within Catherine during those desperately lonely hours in their upscale apartment. Catherine was not constructed of unyielding stone. She harbored profound insecurities, suffocating fears, and relentless doubts that plagued her mind while staring endlessly at their bedroom ceiling. She tortured herself by questioning if her expectations were unreasonably high, wondering if mature love was supposed to feel this agonizingly quiet, if such immense exhaustion was a normal phase of matrimony, or if the growing chasm between them was merely a temporary, survivable season. She confided in her older sister, Sarah, exactly one time, and the response she received was startlingly simple, yet intensely brutal, in its absolute honesty. Sarah gently reminded her that while tranquil, quiet love certainly exists in healthy relationships, it should never inflict such a relentless, hollow ache within her soul. Catherine offered no rebuttal, quietly burying that painful truth deep inside, and persisting in her devoted endurance, because that is the tragic burden borne by those who love with profound, unyielding depth. They tolerate significantly more than they ever should. They anticipate miracles long past the point of reason, and they grant endless second chances that are entirely unearned by their partners. This silent, heavy endurance was precisely what Michael remained entirely blind to, right up until the catastrophic moment when it was permanently too late to salvage anything from the wreckage. The architect of his impending doom was a woman named Valerie, an ambitious financial consultant he encountered during a high-stakes corporate networking symposium in the heart of the financial district. She was profoundly confident, razor-sharp, and possessed an insatiable hunger for aggressive career expansion, mirroring the very traits that drove Michael's own relentless, exhausting professional pursuits. What Michael mistakenly interpreted as a soul-deep connection was merely a flattering reflection of his own towering ego. He was essentially admiring himself in another person's guise. This intoxicating illusion perpetually masquerades as undeniable magic, until the fragile mirror inevitably shatters into a million irreparable fragments, revealing the ugly truth beneath the polished surface. The infidelity did not manifest instantaneously. It seeped into their lives gradually, beginning with a seemingly harmless work text message, progressing to an extended telephone conversation, and eventually evolving into shared laughter that had absolutely nothing to do with corporate spreadsheets. Michael aggressively rationalized his behavior, convincing himself of his own innocence, insisting it was purely platonic, and believing he was vastly too intellectual to succumb to such a pathetic, predictable cliché. Those who arrogantly deem themselves completely immune to temptation are invariably the very first to plummet into the dark abyss of deceit and self-destruction. Merely 2 months following their initial introduction, Michael was effortlessly spinning elaborate webs of lies, fabricating non-existent late-night client dinners, truncating his supposed business trips, and extending meetings into inappropriate, intimate venues across the sprawling city. All the while, Catherine simply observed him with a piercing, quiet dignity, requiring absolutely no tangible evidence to comprehend the betrayal, because a truly loving heart effortlessly deciphers the agonizing language of a guilty silence. One gloomy evening, Catherine remained seated on the edge of their mattress, with the room plunged into darkness, patiently waiting for the heavy sound of the front door opening. When Michael finally stepped into the bedroom, he froze upon seeing her motionless silhouette, nervously asking what was wrong with her in such a hushed environment. She locked her weary eyes onto his for one long, agonizing second, before softly replying that absolutely nothing was wrong, instructing him to go to sleep as she turned her back to him. That night, Michael drifted into a peaceful slumber, blissfully believing his deceptions were secure, while Catherine stared into the blackness, nurturing a growing, terrifying realization in her chest. One fateful Tuesday afternoon, exactly 3 weeks prior to the devastating restaurant revelation, Catherine discovered a life-altering truth while sitting entirely alone on their cold bathroom tiles. Clutching the plastic testing device between her trembling fingers, she confirmed she was exactly 4 weeks into carrying his unborn child. Under any other circumstance, she would have wept tears of overwhelming jubilation, racing to share the miraculous news and illuminating their home with radiant expectation, but instead, she wept from a place of profound, intuitive sorrow. Her body possessed a tragic, ancient wisdom that preceded her conscious thoughts, intimately understanding that the foundation of her life was fundamentally fractured beyond any hope of repair. She meticulously concealed the positive test, disposing of it in an anonymous waste receptacle at her corporate office, and chose to shoulder the immense, crushing weight of her secret in absolute solitude. For 3 grueling weeks, she painted on a convincing smile during their morning coffees, politely inquiring about his daily agendas, while quietly carrying a monumental truth that outweighed everything else in her universe combined. The most agonizing detail omitted from casual retellings of this tragedy is the heartbreaking reality that Catherine nearly confessed the truth to him on a relatively peaceful Wednesday evening. Michael had returned to their apartment, radiating a buoyant mood, presenting her with a modest bouquet of delicate wildflowers reminiscent of their wedding day, sparking a fleeting flicker of hope within her battered chest. As she arranged the delicate stems in fresh water, she parted her lips, standing mere seconds away from joyously declaring that she was carrying their first child. In that exact, suspended fraction of time, his cellular device vibrated aggressively against the polished dining table, demanding his immediate, undivided attention above all else. He devoured the illuminated message with frantic urgency, concealing the device in his pocket with a suspicious velocity that required no verbal translation for a woman already intimately acquainted with his deceit. Catherine instantly clamped her mouth shut, softly complimented the beauty of the floral arrangement, and permanently swallowed the words that might have altered their shared destiny forever. The tipping point arrived on a sunny Saturday, when Michael casually announced an impromptu luncheon with a highly demanding prospective client, feigning a polite reluctance to leave her alone in the apartment. Catherine simply nodded her head, offering to accompany him just to test his reaction, and predictably, he nervously declined her company, prompting her to dress carefully and silently shadow his path toward the city center. She did not trail him out of a frenzied, desperate rage, but rather with the chilling, calculated tranquility of a woman who already completely understands the impending devastation and simply requires visual confirmation to finally sever the remaining ties. Yet, a tiny, fragile fragment of her soul still desperately prayed to the heavens that her instincts were flawed, yearning to arrive at the venue and discover him entirely alone, wishing with all her might that she was merely a paranoid, foolish wife. That desperate, hoping fragment of her heart would ultimately require the longest span of time to properly heal and forgive itself for being so wonderfully naive. The establishment he chose was overwhelmingly luxurious, featuring intimately dimmed lighting, pristine white linen tablecloths, and an atmosphere thick with exclusive privilege. Catherine stepped through the grand entrance, requested a small table for one, and instantly spotted him with Valerie, their hands intertwined, cementing the absolute end of her marriage. With that terrifying clarity came the permanent extinguishing of her marital devotion. She slowly rose from her seat, placed adequate currency upon the table to cover her untouched beverage, smoothed her hair, and exited without ever casting a glance backward. She stepped onto the bustling Chicago pavement, leaned heavily against a brick wall as her hands began to tremble violently for exactly 3 minutes, and then she made the most monumental, unyielding decision of her entire existence. She realized that she could never raise a child in a home built upon a foundation of continuous lies and absent affection. Michael returned to their apartment at exactly 10 o'clock that evening, carrying a foreign scent and wearing an unfamiliar, guilty smile on his face that he vainly attempted to hide. Catherine was peacefully seated in the living room, holding her paperback novel in the correct, upright position, and when he casually inquired about her day, she locked eyes with him for precisely 3 seconds before returning to her literature. He remained entirely oblivious to the monumental shift in the atmosphere, sleeping soundly beside her without making physical contact, while she lay wide awake, meticulously constructing her elaborate escape plan. During the darkest hour of the night, specifically around 2 o'clock in the morning, Catherine spent 5 agonizing minutes watching him slumber, genuinely debating whether to wake him, confront the infidelity, and desperately search for any remaining fragments of their love. Ultimately, she turned her back to him and chose the protective armor of silence, profoundly aware that asking questions to which you already know the devastating answers only provides the betrayer with a second opportunity to inflict catastrophic pain. Over the subsequent 14 days, Catherine functioned with terrifying perfection, brewing his morning coffee, listening to his fabricated schedules, and smiling at precisely the appropriate intervals without raising a single, passing suspicion. Beneath this flawless veneer of domestic normalcy, she systematically dismantled her life in the city, transferring her corporate duties to a permanent remote arrangement and securing a modest, quiet residence in the distant, peaceful town of Galena, Illinois. She contacted her fiercely loyal sister, Sarah, delivering the unfiltered truth without any dramatic embellishments, and received a promise of unconditional emotional support without a single word of harsh judgment. She visited her banking institution, legally separating only the funds she had personally earned, ensuring she did not extract a single penny more or less than what was rightfully hers to claim. Finally, she consulted a legal professional, while Michael was allegedly attending another phantom seminar, thoroughly understanding her rights and the heavy responsibilities of the life growing inside her. On a crisp Monday morning, while the relentless spray of the shower masked her movements, Catherine smoothly loaded 2 compact suitcases into her vehicle, containing only essential documents, a cherished photograph of her late mother, and the upside-down book from the day they met. She placed her set of house keys gently upon the kitchen island, briefly considering leaving a handwritten explanation, but ultimately realized that written words are exclusively meant for those who possess the capacity to truly listen. Michael stepped out of the bathroom at exactly 20 minutes past 8, discovering the empty apartment, the abandoned keys, and a disconnected cellular line. Yet his initial reaction was not panic, but rather a supreme, arrogant annoyance. He foolishly assumed she was throwing a temporary tantrum and would inevitably return, treating her absence with the same dismissive entitlement one reserves for a misplaced household item, utterly blind to the reality that his empire was already collapsing. He invited Valerie to occupy the empty space merely 3 weeks after Catherine's departure, attempting to hastily construct a shiny new reality atop the uncleaned wreckage of his former life. Valerie proved to be the exact polar opposite of Catherine. Where Catherine offered restful, healing silence, Valerie demanded exhausting, relentless attention, aggressively inserting herself into his financial consultancy and making disastrous unilateral business decisions that rapidly hemorrhaged their most valuable clients. The inevitable implosion of Michael's new life arrived not with a spectacular explosion, but through the exhausting accumulation of daily, suffocating resentments that drained every ounce of joy from his existence. Valerie finally packed her belongings and departed on a gloomy Tuesday, while Michael was desperately negotiating with a banking institution to restructure a mountain of debt that never should have existed in the first place. Returning to a completely hollow apartment, for the second time in his life, he finally recognized the terrifying distinction. The first time he had chosen poorly, but this time his poor choice had actively chosen to abandon him. Suffocating under the crushing weight of his monumental failures, he contacted Robert, his only remaining authentic friend, who consistently refused to sugarcoat the ugly realities of life. Robert listened patiently to the pathetic litany of complaints before delivering a merciless verdict, reminding Michael that he had spent years deliberately making the wrong choices and ignoring every genuine warning sign presented to him. When asked about Catherine's whereabouts, Robert firmly advised him to begin by facing his own demons, abruptly terminating the phone call and leaving Michael entirely alone with his echoing, inescapable guilt. It required 6 grueling months of absolute isolation, desperate financial restructuring, and agonizingly silent nights for Michael to completely peel away the thick bandages of his own blinding ego. He systematically unpacked the timeline of his arrogance, finally understanding that he had catastrophically mistaken Catherine's profound loyalty for pathetic conformity, and had disastrously traded a woman who loved his soul for a woman who merely coveted his superficial resources. Meanwhile, comfortably settled in the charming, historic streets of Galena, Catherine discovered an unexpected pillar of support in Evelyn, a deeply compassionate elderly woman who owned a local bookstore and possessed a heart full of maternal wisdom. When Tyler finally arrived into the world on a bright Wednesday in June, weighing a healthy 7 pounds and bearing Michael's dark, expressive eyes, Catherine wept with a profound mixture of liberating joy and residual sorrow. Surrounded by her sister Sarah and the gentle bookstore owner, she fiercely promised her newborn that she would always be magnificently enough for the both of them. Tyler grew into a vibrant, inquisitive child, spending his afternoons reading surrounded by the dusty shelves of Evelyn's shop, treating the older woman like a devoted grandmother. When the boy reached 4 years of age, he innocently asked about his father for the very first time, prompting Catherine to kneel down to his eye level and deliver the most gentle, honest truth she could muster. She explained that his father could not stay with them, but assured him that their little home held all the unconditional love he would ever need to thrive in this beautiful world. Tyler accepted this explanation with the profound, uncomplicated grace that only children possess, simply asking if he would ever have the chance to meet the man who gave him his dark eyes. Catherine swallowed the lump in her throat, taking 3 long seconds before honestly admitting that she did not know, but promising that she would forever remain steadfastly by his side. That brief, trusting exchange squeezed her heart with a painful intensity that no romantic betrayal could ever possibly match, solidifying her unwavering dedication to his happiness. Driven by an unbearable, clawing need for closure rather than a sense of entitlement, Michael hired a discreet private investigator on a chilly Monday in March, explicitly instructing the professional to merely verify that Catherine was living safely and comfortably. 2 weeks later, the investigator returned with an address in Galena and a single, devastating photograph that completely paralyzed Michael's respiratory system. A candid image of Catherine strolling through a sunlit park, tightly holding the hand of a vibrant 5-year-old boy. The child possessed Catherine's unmistakable aura of profound tranquility, yet his dark, searching eyes were an exact, undeniable replica of Michael's own reflection staring back at him from the glossy paper. The investigator softly delivered the crushing chronological facts. The boy had been born exactly 9 months following her sudden departure, and legally carried only his mother's maiden surname. Michael dropped the photograph onto his mahogany desk, buried his face in his trembling hands, and wept with the agonizing, chest-heaving desperation of a man who finally understands the true, irreversible price of his profound stupidity. He mourned not just the loss of a devoted spouse, but the horrifying realization that he had permanently missed 5 irreplaceable years of his own flesh and blood growing up in the world. He had been completely absent for the magical first steps, utterly deaf to the miraculous first words, and blissfully ignorant of the monumental first day of elementary school with the little red backpack. The most agonizing truth of all was acknowledging that Catherine had not concealed this child out of malicious vindictiveness, but out of a fierce, protective necessity, correctly judging that the boy deserved vastly more than a ghost of a father. Overwhelmed by a profound sense of debilitating shame, Michael drove toward the picturesque town of Galena on a bright Saturday morning, bringing absolutely no legal documents, no expensive bribes, and harboring zero arrogant expectations. He located the modest, charming house, adorned with blooming front garden flowers, and a bright red bicycle leaning casually against the wooden porch railing. He stood frozen on the concrete sidewalk for 20 agonizing minutes, paralyzed by the terrifying question of whether his sudden appearance was an act of genuine bravery or merely another manifestation of his toxic, deeply ingrained selfishness. Just as he finally gathered the fractured remnants of his courage to press the doorbell, the sturdy wooden door unexpectedly swung open, revealing the boy in the flesh. Little Tyler stood proudly, with a miniature backpack slung over one shoulder, staring up at the towering stranger with wide, fearless eyes that held absolutely no prejudice or fear. Before Michael could force a single syllable past his painfully constricted throat, the child tilted his head with a serene, profound wisdom and directly asked if he was the man named Michael. The simple, innocent question felt like a physical blow to Michael's chest, fracturing his already fragile composure completely in half as he stared down at the living consequence of his actions. He managed a pathetic, barely perceptible nod, prompting the boy to study him with an intense, unwavering seriousness that children uniquely possess when evaluating a completely new reality. Tyler calmly stated that his mother was entirely uncertain if they would ever officially meet, but that he personally had already decided he was ready to face the man who shared his face. In that suspended, breathless moment, Catherine materialized softly behind her son, gently resting a protective hand upon his small shoulder while directing her gaze toward Michael. Her eyes contained neither burning hatred nor residual love. They held something vastly more intimidating and powerful, an absolute, unshakable lucidity that saw entirely through his fractured soul. She instructed Tyler to step inside the house for a brief moment, and though the boy hesitated, casting one final lingering look at the stranger, he obediently retreated, leaving the two adults alone on the sun-drenched sidewalk with 5 years of heavy silence wedged firmly between them. Michael shattered the quiet atmosphere first, offering a profoundly broken apology not merely for his unannounced arrival, but for the countless times he had looked directly at her without ever truly seeing her immeasurable worth. He apologized for consistently prioritizing the superficial over the sacred, and for deliberately looking away when he should have been fiercely protecting the fragile foundation of their shared existence. Catherine allowed him to empty his poisoned soul without a single interruption, her posture remaining perfectly still and utterly composed beneath the bright morning sun. When his words finally evaporated into the crisp air, she took a deep, centering breath and delivered a response that would permanently sear itself into the deepest corners of his consciousness. She calmly explained that his ultimate betrayal was not the physical presence of another woman, but the agonizing realization that even when he was physically occupying the same room as her, he was already entirely, irrevocably absent. Michael offered no defense, profoundly aware that absolute, undeniable truth requires no rebuttal, only the quiet dignity of a genuinely remorseful listener, absorbing the heavy weight of his sins. Catherine explicitly refused to grant him immediate absolution that day, deliberately withholding any comforting illusions that their shattered past could ever be magically repaired or ignored for the sake of convenience. However, she established a rigid, uncompromising boundary regarding Tyler, stating that any involvement in the boy's life must be absolute, consistent, and deeply rooted in the mundane, everyday moments, rather than grand, sporadic appearances. She fiercely declared that a child can grow perfectly whole without a father, but a child burdened with an inconsistent, ghost-like parent carries a destructive, heavy shadow forever, and she absolutely refused to curse her son with such a tragic fate. Over the subsequent years, the painful process of integration was anything but a cinematic fairy tale. It was constructed upon incredibly difficult conversations, awkward visitations, and the slow, grueling labor of proving one's character through consistent, unglamorous actions. Michael gradually learned to arrive exactly when he promised, actively engaging with Tyler's Little League baseball coach, Mr. Henderson, and genuinely listening to the boy's endless stories instead of merely hearing the background noise. He finally comprehended that authentic presence is measured not in grand financial gestures, but in the quiet, reliable moments of showing up, day after day, regardless of personal convenience or utter exhaustion. When Tyler celebrated his 7th birthday during a warm June afternoon, Michael was simply present in the backyard, holding a standard bakery cake and a regular baseball glove, having entirely abandoned the toxic belief that expensive gifts could somehow purchase lost time. As the boy squeezed his eyes shut to make his silent wish over the flickering candles, he opened them, looked directly at Michael, and softly whispered that he had wished for his father to permanently stay. Michael could not formulate a verbal response, merely resting his trembling hand upon his son's shoulder, understanding that this singular, quiet gesture held infinitely more value than his entire former corporate empire combined. Catherine observed this tender interaction from the kitchen window, turning around to place the ceramic plates upon the counter, with her eyes shimmering with a complex mixture of emotions. She did not feel the crushing sadness of the past, but rather a profound recognition that something fundamentally broken was slowly beginning to take a completely new shape, bearing highly visible scars, but holding a sturdy, undeniable form. Michael had finally learned, at a tremendous personal cost, that true redemption is not found in grandiose apologies, but in the relentless, quiet dedication to never repeating the exact same devastating mistakes. One quiet afternoon, while watching Tyler practice his swing with Mr. Henderson at the local park, Michael reflected deeply on the harsh conversation he had shared with Robert years prior regarding the nature of profound loss. He realized that the universe frequently demands we surrender the very thing we falsely believed we controlled, in order to teach us the irreplaceable value of authentic, selfless devotion. Catherine never returned to being his wife, maintaining her dignified boundaries and finding her own absolute peace, but she courageously permitted him the sacred opportunity to finally learn how to be a father. This story does not conclude with a miraculous romantic reconciliation, because reality rarely adheres to the comforting scripts we desperately wish to write for ourselves when we are hurting. Instead, it ends with a vastly more important triumph. A fundamentally flawed man learning to navigate his immense regret by transforming his crippling guilt into consistent, loving action for the sake of an innocent child. Catherine continued to be the remarkable woman who read the endings of books first, but this time she chose to patiently endure the unpredictable process of life, demonstrating that true bravery often lies in leaving the door slightly ajar rather than building an impenetrable fortress. The journey of healing between them remained a delicate, ongoing negotiation, a testament to the immense resilience of the human spirit when confronted with the devastating consequences of past negligence. Tyler grew up with the reassuring certainty that while his parents did not reside under the same roof, he was surrounded by a community of love, from his devoted mother and his Aunt Sarah to Evelyn, the bookstore owner, and eventually, a father who learned to truly stay. Michael carried the heavy ghost of his lost 5 years every single day, utilizing that sharp, lingering pain as a constant compass to ensure he never again lost sight of what genuinely mattered. Life continuously teaches us that the currency of time is ruthlessly unforgiving, entirely incapable of being refunded, negotiated, or earned back once it has been recklessly spent on trivial pursuits. The quiet, enduring patience of the people who truly love you is never an infinite well to be drawn from without consequence. It requires daily nourishment, genuine emotional presence, and the active choice to value them while they are still standing right in front of you. When you habitually look past the devotion of a good person, you are silently writing the tragic ending to a story. You will inevitably beg the universe to let you start over. Therefore, the most profound lesson we must internalize from the wreckage of broken bonds is the absolute necessity of cherishing the quiet, unglamorous devotion in our lives right now, today, before it quietly slips away. Do not wait for the catastrophic silence of a permanently empty room to finally recognize the immeasurable worth of the person who patiently kept your dinner warm and endured your thoughtless absences. True love is not sustained by magnificent, sporadic gestures, but by the relentless, daily commitment to truly seeing the people who hold our hearts, actively choosing them in the minuscule, seemingly insignificant moments that ultimately construct the entire foundation of a meaningful existence.